G'day everyone, and welcome to the latest tutorial from Just the Basics. Today, we're going to be using the brand new Blender version 2.92 to create a photorealistic forest. So, let's dive straight in. In our tutorial today, we're going to be making use of Quixel Megascans. This is a paid-for subscription. However, if you're not interested in using any paid-for subscriptions, I'm going to be linking some alternatives. This is purely just for getting our textures and resources for creating this scene. This tutorial isn't going to focus on creating PBR materials, rather it's focusing on the process we would take to create a forest. So it will be a step-by-step tutorial. It's just for the sake of time, when it comes to textures, I'm going to be making use of this asset. But once again, if you don't want to use it, you can use other free alternatives such as 3dassets.1, where you can simply enter a keyword and search for a texture of your choice. Otherwise, inside of Blender, we can head over to Edit and Preferences and go to Add-ons and enable the Blender Kit online asset library. Once we do that, you'll see that we have this little search bar with materials, models, brushes, and HDRIs that we can access completely for free in use with our project. So if you want to use that for your textures, that's another great alternative. I just wanted to get this out of the way at the start of the tutorial, as I know many people often dislike it when they get halfway through a tutorial and find out that it requires a paid-for subscription. You may be familiar with Quixel Megascans, and that is that if you do have it in connection with an Unreal Engine license, it is free to use. They're just not licensed for use inside of Blender. So you can do that as a try before you buy unofficial method if you like, but I do find they're very affordable and they also have a great selection of free assets. So now with all that out of the way, let's jump straight into the tutorial. Opening up Blender, let's set a few things up straight away. For starters, we want to go ahead and select render properties and change our render engine from Eevee to Cycles. I also want to set my render device to GPU compute. Here, I'll also adjust my render settings for later. I'll change the sample amount down to 50, activate adaptive sampling, and under denoising, just turn that on and select optics denoising. Next, under my world settings, I want to change the color to sky texture. This will load up the brand new sky texture, which is fantastic for creating realistic lighting. Finally, to set things up, I'm going to head to Edit and Preferences, and under my add-ons once more, I'm going to enable another add-on. This is the Sapling Tree Generator add-on. So if you don't have this enabled already, please do, as this will be super helpful in our tutorial. Now that that's done, let's start creating our base mesh. So initially, I'm going to delete the default cube and default light. Sad face. Next, we'll hit Shift-A and add in a brand new mesh. That's the plane. And then hit S, 1, 0, Enter to scale it up 10 times larger than what it initially was. Now that we've done this, let's go ahead and hit Tab to enter edit mode, and then right-click and select Subdivide. Now I can go ahead and increase the number of cuts from 1 to 50. This will give plenty of geometry to adjust the landscape of my mesh. So having done that, I'll hit Tab to exit edit mode and then switch to the sculpting tab. Here, the brush works very similarly to a Photoshop brush. If you're familiar with that, you can just right click and bring up your radius and strength settings. What we basically want to do is add in a bit of interesting terrain and create a bit of a forest path in the middle of our scene. Something that we can add a bit of a forest trail texture to go through to give a bit of interesting diversity. So have a bit of fun with this. It's a good chance to practice the basics of sculpting. If you want to change your brush, of course, you can just select the brush style down here, or you can always go File and append new brushes in. But for what we're creating today, this is going to be fantastic. Let's jump back to our layout now, right click on our mesh and select Shade Smooth. I'm also going to hit S and Z just to flatten this out a little bit to make it less extreme. Having done that, it's time to import some materials to texture our plane. So to do this with Bridge, all I need is to make sure I've downloaded the latest plugin for Blender, which I'll have a link for in the description. I'll also need to make sure I download Quixel Bridge, which is free to use and just basically the asset library program for your computer. Once you've done that, head into Blender, and once again in our preferences, we'll need to manually install this add-on. So we can head to our downloads and just select that 3.2.zip file. Once we've done that, it'll bring up the Megascans add-on, which we'll need to make sure we enable just by searching Megascans and checking that box next to it. You may need to restart Blender at this point, so I recommend saving your project. Let's just go ahead and call this landscape. And now we can load up Bridge and start importing some materials. So the first thing I want is something that is going to be good for a forest environment. So I'm just going to search forest among what I've already downloaded. And there's a great selection here I can choose from. I'm particularly looking for surfaces. So I'll just search for surface. And I might make use of these ground forest texture. I'm going to set that down to 2K resolution as I don't need anything too high, and just export that into Blender. Having done that, I also need a material for our forest path. So I'll have a look through, and all I want is something that's a bit of a muddy kind of beaten path. I think this rocky soil ground will work fine for what I'm looking for, so I'll set that to 2K resolution and export that as well. Now, what we're going to do is effectively the best method I could find on how to blend two materials inside of Blender. And this is actually not my own technique, but rather one I found from a really great Blender tutorial. So I'll have a link to that in the description because credit where credit is due. What we can do is head to our material properties and select this little material drop down and go ahead and just select the ground forest material first of all. Then we can switch to viewport shading by selecting this icon or hitting Z and 2 on our number pad. Well, we can see how our forest material is looking. It's looking pretty good, although there are some irregularities with it. So to fix these, let's just go up to the top left-hand corner until we see this crosshair, which indicates we can now split our view. By left-clicking and dragging to the right, we've split our view successfully. So let's switch this viewport from 3D to shader editor and hit N to remove this side toolbar here. And now we can edit our material properties a bit easier. Something I will need to adjust is I need to change the normal map from being placed in the alpha slot to the normal. This is due to Blender's principal shader being updated with a new emission strength node. It now pushes all the normal maps out of order just by one slot. So let's just drag that where it's meant to be, normal to normal, and now our texture is looking much better. But it's also a bit too small. I want this texture to feel a bit larger, like it's a forest area. So to scale that up, I'm going to once again go up here to the top left-hand corner, just beneath the little Blender logo, until I see that crosshair, and click and drag down to split this view in half again. This time, I'm going to change the viewport to UV editor. This is where I can control how much of my image is projected onto my plane. And this is just my ideal or preferred workspace. So I know different people may have different preferences, but for this tutorial, I just find this is the easiest way and saves switching between the UV editing and the shading tab. So what we can do then is hit tab to enter edit mode. And with our UV map now appearing, hit A to select all of that. It should appear orange once it's all selected. We can hit S to scale it up. And now let's scale it up 5 times larger than what it was. Having done that, we can hit tab to exit edit mode, but you may notice nothing on our material has actually changed. The reason for this is currently our material is locked to texture coordinate generated. We need to change it that our UV map is affecting our texture. So let's go ahead and now plug UV into vector. And this will now mean that Blender will use our UV map to determine how much of the texture is seen. And you can see now it is scaled up beautifully. But for the next part of our tutorial, we want to be able to blend in our muddy terrain texture for where the path will be. How do we do this? Well, with our material slot still open here, we're going to hit this little addition to add a new material in and select this drop down and select our second texture, which is the rocky soil ground. While we're there, we might also switch this to UV to vector. That way it will be affected by the same UV properties as our forest path is, or our forest floor is, I should say. And we'll also make sure that underneath it, it is not plugged into alpha, but rather normal to normal. Now that we've done that, we're going to need to go ahead and copy all these nodes. Everything except for the material output. In fact, we can delete that material output. So let's go ahead and select all of this and then hit Control C, which is the shortcut for copy. Now, heading back to our top texture, the ground forest, we can hit Control V in the shade editor to paste in our dirt material. With everything still selected that we've just pasted in, we're going to hit G, which stands for grab. Now we can grab that secondary material, that dirt material down, and we have both our forest ground texture here and our forest path texture here. What we want to do is merge the two together. So grabbing our material output node, we're going to stretch it down here. And obviously we cannot plug both principled shaders into the one material output. But what we can do And this is the technique I learned from a previous YouTube tutorial, as mentioned, so not my own idea. But we can hit Shift A and search for a mix shader. Now, dropping this in, we can connect both materials up to this mix shader. Evidently though, it's still only going to display one of them, and in this case, it's our forest path texture now. To correct this, what we can do is hit Shift A and add in 2 extra nodes. One is a vertex color. This will enable us to then choose which texture to display where based on a color. To choose that color, let's hit Shift A and add in our second node, which is a separate RGB. Let's plug color to image. So now we can determine which color we want to use. And we're going to take the red channel. So that's the R and plug it into factor. Now, looking at our scene, it's changed back to being a forest floor once again. Let's go ahead and start adding in this forest path texture now. To do that, we might switch back to solid view so we can see a color, and then switch to vertex paint. The first thing we want to do is change our color from white to completely red. So I've just gone to RGB and I'm minimizing the green and the blue hues from this color. So now we're left with complete red. If I go through and paint my landscape completely red now, notice what happens when I switch back to material preview. You'll notice it's completely showing our forest path texture. So if I go ahead and switch my brush from add to subtract, you'll notice that everywhere I subtract now removes completely my forest path texture, replacing it only with the forest floor. So we can once again right click to bring up our brush settings and paint in everywhere that we want our forest floor to appear, leaving everywhere that we want our forest path to appear. And this is a really fun way to texture. It's actually very simple, very easy to follow, and it can create some nice customizations. So we don't want this path to be too wide. Want it to be somewhat interesting, so have a bit of curving. And that's looking pretty good. In fact, I could even make that a little bit narrower just so it's nothing too extreme. Fantastic. Here we have our nice forest path through a forest. So with that being done, we have completed our base mesh. All we need to do now is populate it with foliage and trees. To do that, let's switch out of vertex paint back to object mode. Let's head to our object properties and just rename this from plane to forest_floor. That way we'll be able to identify it easier later. Now we're going to press H to hide this and begin creating our trees. To do that, we're going to hit Shift A and go down to curve and select sapling tree generator. This will automatically load in a base tree mesh for us. With that loaded, we can now adjust it to create some custom trees. We're going to take a look at creating 3 custom trees and then basically make another 3 variations of those trees. So we'll have a total of 6 trees all up, ready to populate our woods. So the first thing I'll need to do is in the menu under geometry, we're going to load the white birch preset. I'm going to change the shape from custom to inverse conical. Then I'm going to head to branch radius and change the ratio or the thickness of the branches from 0.02 to 0.04. just to increase that slightly. Next, I'll head to branch splitting and change the levels from 2 to 3. This will create more smaller branches off of our larger ones. If this is slowing down your computer at this point though, I recommend turning that level amount down. If your computer can handle it, it's definitely worth having it up a little bit. It just creates that extra level of realism, but it is not necessary. Moving on to our final setting, we can change from branch splitting to leaves. Here under leaves, we're going to press show leaves so you can see what we're doing. The first thing I'll need to do is change my leaf shape from hexagonal to rectangular, as we're going to be applying a texture for all these leaves, so a simple square or rectangle will be much simpler and easier to work with when it comes to our UV maps. Next, let's change the leaf count from 16 to 20. I'm also going to change the leaf scale from 0.2 to 0.5 to make them that much bigger. Having done that, our first tree is complete and ready to go. Let's left click and drag to select it and then hit G and Y to grab it along the Y axis and just move it out of the way for the moment. Now let's go ahead and create our second tree. Once again, we're going to add in a sapling tree generator. We're going to head back to geometry and this time we're going to load the Douglas_FIR preset. This creates a basic pine tree mesh and there's only a few things we'll adjust here. One is the branch splitting. I'll change that from 2 to 3. And the next is the leaves. I'll change this to rectangular instead of hexagonal. I'll also change the leaf count from 25 to 30 just to give a few more, and then the leaf scale from 0.17 to 0.8. So now we have our second tree completed already. Let's go ahead and left click and drag and then hit GY to move that out to the side. It's quite a difference in size to our first tree, so I may just hit S to scale that down the slightest amount. Finally, let's create our last tree. To do this, I'm going to hit Shift A and add in the tree generator add-on again, change back to geometry, and finally load the Japanese maple preset. I'm going to head over to the branch splitting and change the levels from 2 to 3. Then I'm going to head to leaves, enable show leaves, change them from hexagonal to rectangular, then the leaf count from -5 to 30. Finally, the last two settings I'm going to change is the leaf scale. So overall, I'm going to make them twice as big by turning it up to 0.4. And then I'm also going to make the leaves much thicker, so they're less long and rectangular and more squarish by changing the leaf scale on the X from 0.2 to 0.53. This is a value I already worked out before recording this tutorial. So if you want to experiment some more with what you think works best, please feel free to go ahead and do that. Now let's left click and drag to select our tree and hit S to scale that up in size until it's something similar to our trees we've already created. And basically, we have 3 trees here ready to go. What we are missing is textures for these trees. Now the texturing process is really simple and easy. Let's have a bit of a breakdown as to how we go about doing this. The first thing we need to do is convert our tree trunks into a mesh, because currently we added them as a curve. So if we were to go into our curve settings, they would be all curves. For the sake of this tutorial, we're also going to need them as meshes for texturing, as it's much simpler in my opinion. So to change them or convert them to meshes, we simply select our tree trunk and right click and select convert to mesh. Let's do this with the others. Right click and select convert to mesh, and the same with our final pine tree. Now the next thing we need to do is, so we can turn these trees into the one object, we're going to need to adjust some of the naming of the UV properties. What do we mean by that? Well, let's break it down. If I select these leaves and head over to this little green triangle here, which is entitled Object Data Properties, you'll notice that it has an option for UV maps. If I just minimize these others and leave only UV maps open, you'll see that my UV map for this tree has a name. It's currently Leaf UV. The bottom one for the trunk, however, is UV map. Both the leaves and the tree trunk they're connected to need to share the same name if we're to make them one object, that is the one tree with leaves as a mesh later on. So right now, before we do any texturing, let's go ahead and change this name. I'm going to go and just change this simply to 001 and then hit Control A and Control C to copy that and paste that onto the leaves. I'll do the same for my other trees, following suit, making this one 002 and the leaves the same. And finally 003 for my last tree. Now that that's done, it's going to make it nice and simple when it comes to creating these into one mesh. But first, let's add some textures. So I'm going to head back to Quixel and I'm going to select some bark textures first of all. At this point, you can grab textures or resources from whatever is your preferred site. But as I mentioned earlier, this is just the simplest method I've found for creating forests in my VFX workflow. So let's grab this maritime bark, and I'll include links to all the textures that I'm using here if you do wish to use them. I'll also grab this yew bark, and I might grab this elm bark. While I'm here, I might just grab one or two other varieties so I can perhaps mix it up a little bit if I want to create some different variations on these trees. Next, let's go ahead and find some leaves. So these are under the subheading or the tag Atlas usually. And so I've got a few downloaded that I can use straight away. I'll go ahead and just import them. And having done that, I can jump back into Blender and begin the texturing process. Now, this texturing process is very simple, and in fact, it may be a bit repetitive, so it's only really necessary to show you how to do it on one tree, and this can then be repeated across the others. So let's break that down. Selecting a tree trunk, I'm going to hit Tab to enter edit mode. I need to unwrap this tree, or in other words, tell Blender how a 3D mesh should display a 2D material. To do that, I'll hit A to select everything. Once it's orange, you know it's all selected. Then I can hit U and select Cube Projection. Although our tree is not a cube, it's made up of many smaller cubes, so this is the best method for projecting trees I've found currently. Let's go ahead and select that. And now, with our tree appearing unwrapped in our UV image editor, we can hit A to select that entire mask, and then S to scale it up and hit 10 and enter. So our tree's UV map will now be 10 times larger than it was initially. Let's give it a material now. In our material settings, I'm just going to select one from the drop-down menu. I might go with birch bark first of all. And here you can see we have a similar issue from our materials earlier. We need to make sure the normal map is plugged into normal, and we also need to make sure that the UV coordinate is plugged into vector. Having done that, I can now tab out of edit mode, and you'll see that my tree bark texture is applying nicely. Now for the leaves, let's just go ahead and select a drop down set of leaves, and then we can go to our material and just adjust these irregularities. UV to vector again, and of course, normal to normal, in this case, emission strength into alpha. Now this UV map needs to be adjusted only slightly. I'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and I can see that I have currently 4 leaves, but only part of them is being portrayed. So let's hit S and Y to scale this down vertically into more of a square, similar to the shape of our actual leaves. Then I'll move this over just one leaf and scale it down until it is only covering that one leaf. Now, having done that, we have our first tree completely textured. And if I tab out of edit mode, you'll see that it's looking pretty good. If I hit Z and then switch to rendered view, we can give it a quick preview and just see if we're happy with how our tree is looking. And for the most part, I think I'm pretty happy with that for the amount of time it's taken us to create. If you prefer to buy tree assets, that's always another option, but this is just a nice simple way to create them easily inside of Blender. Then let's move on to our other trees. We'll head back to material preview, and this method is essentially repeated what we have already done. So I'm just going to speed up this, and you can listen to some music as you texture your trees as well, because it is essentially the same thing. Let me know if you have any questions there in the comments, and I'm happy to answer them as soon as I can. So let's do some texturing. Okay, now that we've done that and we have all of our trees textured and ready to go, we can create some variety on these trees. So let's just select our first tree trunk. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate that, then hit X to just lock it to the X axis and move it forward a little bit. This is going to act as basically a bit of a dead tree that can sit in our forest. So let's rotate this on the Z 180 degrees and then hit S and Y to just shrink it a little bit and make it a bit more unique. Having done that, let's go ahead and select our other 2 trees and just go ahead and hit Shift D to duplicate them and move them forward a little bit. So what I'm going to do then is grab this first tree here, and I'm going to go ahead and just select this hazel leaves and select one of the other leaf varieties to give it a bit more random variety. Having done that, we now have a little bit of a difference in variety between these 2 trees. I might also select the trunk and change the bark type as well. So I'm going to change this one to U bark. And that's looking good. We've got some nice randomness in the trees. And for my last one, I'm only going to adjust the type of branch it's displaying by changing it on the UV map. So now, essentially, we have a variety of 6 different trees. Although they're somewhat similar, it'll be enough to create some believability to our forest. Having done that, let's go ahead and make all the trees one object. So I'll just select each one, the leaves and the branch, and then hit Ctrl J to make them into one object. Now that we've done that, we can left click and select to grab all of them, or drag all of them rather, over to the side. So let's just enable our little arrows here and move them out of the way of our finished plane. And while we have them all selected, I'm going to hit Ctrl G, which stands for group or collection. This will get them all as one group of objects when we add them to our scene, so we can essentially just duplicate that multiple times to create a forest. So let's call this forest trees. Now that we've done that, we can hit enter, and it's time to import any final assets or touches we want for our forest. So for me, I'm going to jump back into Bridge, and I'm going to add in some other different assets I like. For example, this common firm will work really nicely. So I'll just set that to 2K, then export that. Jumping back into Blender, I'll be able to see that that's just imported in here. And I can scale it up a little bit until it's about the size I want it to be in relation to my trees. This will just help as well a bit later on, because we can size it up in the hair particle properties, but it's better if we have everything to scale before doing that. I need to adjust the materials on this slightly as well. And having done that, I can go back to Bridge and just grab a few other assets. For example, I also like having some grass, so I might just grab some of this grass clump and switch that to 2K, then export that. This one likewise, I can scale up a little bit and then drag that out of the way for use later. And finally, the last thing I'll need is perhaps some clover. I like this as a nice covering alternative to grass. So with that imported, we have all the foliage that we need in our scene. So let's once again drag this out of the way, maybe scale it up a little bit to size. And what we're going to need to do is select all of these different assets we've just created, and we're going to need to create them into one collection as well, which will be our foliage collection. So what we can do is just maximize all of them in our scene collection, and just go ahead and pressing Control, we can select all those LODs, that is level of detail models, and select them all there by holding down Control and left clicking. Now I can hit Control G to add in a new group or collection, and this time I'm going to call it Foliage. Having done that, we now have a collection made up of our unique assets. So the final thing to do is add them to our forest. Jumping up to our menu here, we can see our forest floor is currently set to invisible. Let's enable visibility again, and here we will see our forest. What we want to do is we want to control where our forest will be appearing. We don't want it to appear obviously on our path, perhaps just little bits of shrub. So what we'll do is we'll select our plane, and then we'll head over from object mode to weight paint. And here in weight paint, we can paint in essentially where we want our forest to appear. So all I'm going to do is paint in everywhere the path isn't. Make it nice and red. The greener or yellow areas will only have a slight amount of our forest assets being displayed. We can adjust this by changing the weight or radius and the strength. So let's just turn that weight back up to full for the moment, and then we might feather it out closer to the edges. So having painted that in, we might just go turn down the weight a little bit and turn down the strength, and we can just feather in our edges a little bit more. Perhaps even adding a little bit of feathering in some of the spots too. Now with our weight map completely drawn up, what we can do is we can head back to our object mode and add in our hair particle system. So that's found under the particle properties, symbolized by this little blue particle symbol. Let's hit plus to add a new one in, and we're going to call this forest trees. It's always good practice to get in the habit of renaming things to what they actually represent. Definitely makes your workflow much easier. Let's change this from emitter to hair, change this to advanced settings, and then head down to render. And instead of rendering a path, we're going to render a collection. So let's select our forest trees collection. Now you can see our forest trees are appearing all displayed incorrectly. This is to do with the origin of these trees. So to fix this, we need to head to rotation. Let's enable that first of all, and then change them from orientation axis velocity / hair to global Y. Now all our trees will be standing up vertically, which is fantastic. We have a few too many trees here, so let's change that number down from 1000 to 200, make it a bit lighter. So now let's go ahead and change the scale randomness from 0 to 0.05 to give a bit more of randomness. We might even turn it up to 0.1. Now, they're still covering our forest path. To apply the weight paint that we've added in, what we can do is we can head down to our vertex groups. Here's where we can control the density or the areas of our map, our mesh, that will have our hair particle system displayed. If we select density, you'll see it brings up one option, group. This is the weight painting we just did earlier. If we select that, you'll see now there is a clearing or a partial clearing where our forest path is. We can correct this a little bit by heading back to weight paint and just maybe moving by going ahead to subtract, removing some of the painting that's near the edges, as evidently it's a bit too close. That way we can just clear up any trees that might be on our path. Excellent, that's looking great. Let's head back to object mode now, And let's go ahead and add in our foliage to complete the look. To do that, we're going to need to go ahead and add in another particle system by hitting this plus again. This time we'll call it grass, or even foliage would be better, wouldn't it? And let's go to hair, advanced, check rotation, change it to global Z this time. Go under render and change it to collection and select our foliage collection. And now you can see our foliage is being portrayed excellently across the world. We might go down to vertex groups and just enable our weight map again. And here it's all off to the side. So then all we have left to do is turn that count up a little bit, maybe to 10,000 and see how that's looking. It's definitely covering it very well. So we can probably turn that down to half. 5,000 might be more appropriate. Now it's time to render our scene and have a preview of how it's looking. So let's go to rendered view and just deselect that. And what I might do is hit 0 to jump to my camera view. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, then hit N and bring up my little transform properties and switch to view and select lock camera to view. So now wherever I scroll while in my camera view is what I will see. I can move the camera around and hit N to remove that. Then I can head over to my output properties and just select render only the region inside my camera. So now let's just line up a nice shot and have a look at how our scene is appearing. Well, we can see already it's looking really nice. In fact, it's very believable just from this scene here, but we might need to add some more randomness to it. So let's go back to material preview for a moment and jump into our hair particle settings again for our forest trees. I might just rename them up here, as it doesn't seem to have affected that name. Now, forest trees, what I want to do is I want to add in some randomness to the rotation. So let's change this from 0 to 0.1. And now we have a bit more randomness, maybe down a little bit, 0.06. That's a bit better. I might also turn that phase up just a little bit. And that's looking pretty good. Maybe under physics, we can also just turn up the Brownian value a little bit. This gives a bit more of a randomness to our trees. And finally, let's head over to our foliage settings. I'm going to just change the scale randomness from 0 to 0.05. Give them a bit more randomness there. And also the random rotation to 0.06 as well. And now let's give this a render again. That little bit of randomness, I think, has gone a long way in just selling the scene much more. There might be still too much foliage, so we can experiment with these numbers, maybe try 3,000. I just might adjust the amount of trees that are in my scene by turning that down to 100, as well, as I was just experimenting and I like that look a little bit more. I might also adjust my lighting by heading to the world lighting tab and just changing the rotation, as I find sometimes this can give you much nicer results just depending on where you want your lighting to be. I'll also go back to my render property and change the color management look from none to very high contrast. I like this high saturation contrast look a bit better. I think it just looks that much nicer. I'll select my camera just here in my scene collection, and under my camera settings, I'm going to change the focal length to wide by changing it from 50 to 30 millimeters. And then I'm also going to enable depth of field. All that's left to do now is render out our final scene. So hopefully that was simple enough to follow along. I hope it made sense and hope you guys enjoyed watching. Thanks so much again for your support, and I can't wait to see what we get to make together next time. Well, everyone, thanks again, and for now, that has been just the basics of how to create a photorealistic forest inside of Blender.